Here's a contradiction that sits at the heart of one of gaming's most beloved characters. Geralt of Rivia will tell you, repeatedly, that witchers don't have emotions, that the mutation stripped all that away. He says it with conviction, he says it like he believes it, and then he spends 3 games proving himself completely, utterly wrong. He'll claim he doesn't care while going to war for a surrogate daughter. He'll insist he's just doing a job while falling into deeply complicated romantic entanglements. He'll shrug off the weight of his choices while clearly being haunted by the ones that went wrong. So what's actually going on here? Is Geralt lying? Is he in denial? Or is something more psychologically complex at play? The lie that keeps him functional. Let's start with the big one, the foundational claim that Geralt makes about himself throughout the series. Witchers don't have emotions. The trial of the grasses, that brutal mutation process that turned him into what he is, supposedly stripped away his capacity to feel. Except, the games don't show us someone without emotions. They show us someone who's desperately trying to convince himself and others that he doesn't have them. And there's a massive psychological difference between those two things. Watch Geralt in any emotionally charged moment. When Vesemir dies in Wild Hunt, Geralt doesn't react with blank indifference. There's grief there. Controlled, yes. Suppressed, absolutely. But present. When he finds Ciri seemingly dead on the Isle of Mists, the man who supposedly can't feel anything falls to his knees. The player feels that moment because Geralt feels that moment. So what's actually happening here? There's a concept in psychology called intellectualization. It's a defense mechanism, first described in the psychoanalytic tradition and later refined by researchers like George Vaillant, who studied how people cope with stress and trauma. Intellectualization is when someone deals with emotional distress by retreating into abstract reasoning or clinical detachment. Instead of feeling the fear, you analyze the threat. Instead of experiencing grief, you discuss death philosophically. Geralt's "witchers have no emotions" isn't just a belief, it's a psychological tool. It's intellectualization weaponized into an identity. By framing his emotional distance as biological fact rather than psychological choice, he gives himself permission not to engage with feelings that would otherwise be overwhelming. And honestly, given his life, that makes complete sense. Think about what Geralt has experienced. He was abandoned as a child, handed over to witchers, and subjected to mutations that killed most of the children who underwent them. His entire existence since then has been defined by violence, loss, and being treated as subhuman by the majority of people he meets. He's a professional killer who regularly faces his own mortality. The people he gets close to have a tendency to die, betray him, or disappear. If you actually felt all of that fully, with complete emotional engagement, you would be destroyed. You wouldn't be able to function. This is where Geralt's claimed emotional void serves a protective purpose. In psychology, we talk about functional versus dysfunctional coping. A coping mechanism is functional when it allows someone to navigate their environment effectively, even if it's not ideal. And for a witcher, emotional blunting is genuinely functional. You can't hesitate when fighting a griffin because you're processing your feelings about the last village that chased you out with pitchforks. But here's the cost, and the games show this too. Functional coping mechanisms can become prisons. Geralt is so practiced at suppressing emotion that he sometimes can't access it even when it would serve him. Watch his early interactions with Yennefer or Triss in any of the games. There's this hesitancy, this guardedness, even when he clearly wants connection. He's so used to not feeling that when he does feel, he doesn't always know what to do with it. There's another layer here worth exploring. Geralt doesn't just suppress emotions. He often seems to have difficulty identifying them in the first place. Psychologists call this alexithymia, which literally translates to no words for emotions. People with alexithymic traits can experience emotional states in their bodies, tension, restlessness, a sense of something being wrong, without being able to label those states as specific feelings like anger, sadness, or fear. Watch how Geralt talks about his own internal experience when he's forced to. It's vague, it's physical. He'll talk about a gut feeling or something not sitting right or a sense of wrongness. Rarely does he say, "I'm angry," or "I'm scared," or "I'm grieving." He experiences emotions almost as background noise that he then needs to interpret, often incorrectly, or dismiss entirely. Monster, mutant, man. The question of what Geralt is. Here's something that comes up over and over in the Witcher games. The question of what makes a monster. Geralt kills monsters for a living, but he's constantly confronted with creatures that blur the line. Intelligent monsters who just want to be left alone. Humans who are more monstrous than any beast. And always, hovering in the background, the question of what category he falls into. This isn't just philosophical flavor, this is about identity. and specifically about what psychologists call stigmatized identity and how people incorporate social rejection into their sense of self. Geralt exists in a world that has made up its mind about what he is. He's called a freak, a mutant, a monster. He's refused service at taverns. He's blamed for problems he didn't cause. Children are told stories about witches that paint them as dangerous and inhuman, and he's been hearing this for decades, possibly centuries. There's extensive psychological research on what happens when someone is systematically dehumanized by their society. It's been studied in the context of racism, disability, mental illness, and other stigmatized identities. And one consistent finding is that stigma gets internalized. People don't just face external prejudice, they absorb it. They start to wonder if maybe the things being said about them are true. You see this in Geralt constantly, not as explicit self-hatred, but as a quiet uncertainty about his own nature. When he's asked if witches can love, there's hesitation. When he's confronted with accusations of being a monster, his denials don't always carry full conviction. He's spent so long being told he's not quite human that part of him seems to wonder if they're right. This connects to what Carl Jung called the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of yourself that you reject, suppress, or deny. It contains the aspects of your personality that don't fit with your conscious self-image. And critically, the more you deny your shadow, the more power it has over you. Geralt's shadow is the monster that others see him as. It's the capacity for violence, the emotional coldness, the predatory nature. And the games put him in constant dialogue with this shadow through the monsters he hunts and the choices he makes. Think about some of the more memorable moral quandaries in the series. The Bloody Baron questline, the situation with the Whispering Hillock, the choices around the Doppler in Novigrad, or the troll who killed the Redanian soldiers. Over and over, Geralt is asked to judge what constitutes a monster, and in doing so, he's implicitly defining himself. When Geralt chooses to spare a creature that others would kill without question, he's asserting that the label monster is too simple. That context matters. That capacity for harm isn't the same as deserving death. And psychologically, he's doing something profound. He's refusing to accept the black and white thinking that would condemn him as well. This is a known psychological pattern. People with stigmatized identities often cope by developing more nuanced, complex frameworks for judgment. If the simple framework damns you, you learn to see beyond simple frameworks. Geralt's moral sophistication isn't just character depth, it's a survival strategy for someone who needs the world to be more complicated than humans good, non-humans bad. But here's the tension, Geralt still kills, he's still a Witcher, he still takes contracts on creatures that might have inner lives, and he still makes lethal judgments about what deserves to die. He can't fully escape the role that society has assigned him. What the games show us is someone who's found a middle path. Geralt doesn't reject the monster hunter identity, he refines it. He develops his own code, his own lines that he won't cross. He decides that witches don't kill dragons, or that certain sapient creatures get a chance to prove their intentions. He's not trying to convince the world he's not a monster, he's defining for himself what kind of monster he's willing to be. This is what psychologists call identity achievement. It's the final stage in James Marsh's model of identity development. In this stage, a person has explored alternatives, faced crises, and arrived at a self-chosen identity rather than one that was simply imposed on them. Geralt didn't choose to be a Witcher, but he's chosen what kind of Witcher to be. He's taken the identity that was forced on him and made it his own. And the beautiful thing is that by doing this, by engaging seriously with the question of what he is, Geralt actually becomes more human than many of the humans around him. The racists and zealots who call him a monster rarely examine their own nature. They accept simple categories because simple categories serve them. Geralt, forced by his position to think harder, ends up with a more integrated and authentic sense of self. Love and the Lone Wolf. Geralt's attachment patterns. For someone who claims to be an emotionless mutant, Geralt sure does form a lot of significant relationships. Yennefer, Triss, Dandelion, Zoltan, Vesemir, and the Witches, and most importantly Ciri. Let's talk about attachment, because this is where the gap between who Geralt claims to be and who he actually is becomes most obvious. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth and others, describes patterns in how people form and maintain close relationships. These patterns develop in childhood based on how caregivers responded to needs, and they tend to persist into adulthood, shaping romantic relationships, friendships, and how people parent. The four main attachment styles are secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. And if we're profiling Geralt, he's pretty clearly in the dismissive avoidant category. Dismissive avoidant attachment develops when caregivers are consistently unresponsive or rejecting. The child learns that expressing needs leads to disappointment, so they adapt by becoming self-reliant to a fault. As adults, dismissive avoidant people tend to value independence, discomfort with emotional intimacy, and difficulty depending on others. They often downplay the importance of relationships while simultaneously maintaining them. Sound like anyone? Geralt was literally abandoned as a child and handed over to witches. His formative experiences involved brutal training, mutation, and an environment that probably didn't prioritize emotional attunement. The other witches likely had their own attachment issues, creating a culture of stoicism and self-reliance at Kaer Morhen. What's fascinating about the games is how they show Geralt's avoidant patterns playing out while also showing his underlying need for connection. He'll push people away, claim he works alone, insist that his relationships are casual or contractual, and then he'll cross continents and fight armies for the people he cares about. This is textbook avoidant behavior, by the way. Avoidantly attached people aren't actually less attached, they're often deeply attached while being uncomfortable with that attachment. The self-reliance is a defense, not an absence of need. Look at his romantic relationships. With Yennefer, there's this push-pull dynamic that spans the entire series. They come together intensely, then separate, then reunite. Geralt is drawn to her, but also afraid of the vulnerability she represents. Yennefer, who has her own attachment complexities, mirrors this pattern. They're two avoidant people trying to love each other without admitting how much they need to. With Triss, depending on how the player engages, there's often a different dynamic. She's more openly expressive, which can feel safer for an avoidant person because the emotional work is being done by the other party. But this also creates its own problems because Geralt isn't being pushed to actually grow. The most psychologically revealing relationship, though, is with Ciri. Because Ciri breaks through Geralt's avoidant defenses in a way that no romantic partner does. Why? Because the parent-child bond operates on different psychological wiring than romantic attachment. Geralt's protectiveness towards Ciri isn't something he can intellectualize away. It's not complicated by the vulnerability of romantic love or the fear of abandonment by a partner. It's this primal, almost biological drive to keep her safe, even though she's not biologically his. And here's the thing about found family that the games understand intuitively. For people with attachment wounds, chosen family can sometimes be more healing than family of origin. When you're abandoned by the people who are supposed to care for you, being chosen by someone and choosing them back rewrites part of that narrative. Geralt becoming Ciri's father figure isn't just character development, it's attachment repair. Watch how Geralt behaves when Ciri is involved versus other situations. His emotional range expands, his willingness to be vulnerable increases. He expresses fear, hope, pride, emotions he normally keeps locked away. Ciri accesses a version of Geralt that romantic partners only glimpse occasionally. This makes the end of Wild Hunt, particularly the endings where Ciri lives, so emotionally resonant. The final relationship outcome we're invested in isn't necessarily who Geralt ends up with romantically, it's whether he gets to keep being Ciri's father. That's the attachment that truly transformed him. Living in the Grey, the psychology of impossible choices. The Witcher games are famous for moral complexity. There are very few clear-cut good choices. Almost every major decision involves trade-offs, unintended consequences, or choosing between terrible options. This isn't just good writing, it's also an accurate representation of a specific psychological burden. Moral injury. Moral injury is a concept that originated in military psychology. It describes the lasting psychological harm that comes from perpetrating, failing to prevent, or witnessing acts that violate one's moral code. It's distinct from PTSD, though they often co-occur. PTSD is about threat and fear. Moral injury is about meaning and guilt. Geralt's entire career is a moral injury generator. He kills for money. Sometimes the creatures he kills don't clearly deserve death. Sometimes the humans who hire him are worse than the monsters. Sometimes he makes a call that seems right and watches it lead to catastrophe. The Bloody Baron questline is maybe the purest example of this. There's no good ending. Whatever Geralt chooses, someone suffers. He can't save everyone. He might not be able to save anyone, and after it's all done, he has to carry the weight of what happened. This is where Geralt's famous neutrality comes from. Early in the saga, Geralt tries to stay out of political conflicts, personal vendettas, the bigger fights between powerful groups. He's just a Witcher, he does contracts, he doesn't take sides. Psychologically, this neutrality is a defense against moral injury. If you don't get involved, you can't be responsible. If you're just killing monsters for coin, you're not making moral choices, you're doing a job. Neutrality is an attempt to avoid the unbearable weight of consequence, but the games won't let him stay neutral. They keep forcing involvement. By Wild Hunt, Geralt is neck deep in politics, wars, the fate of empires. He can't pretend to be just a contractor anymore. The neutrality defense has failed. What's interesting is how Geralt responds to this failure. He doesn't become a crusader, he doesn't adopt a rigid moral code that simplifies everything. Instead, he develops something more mature. He accepts that he's going to make imperfect choices and tries to make them as carefully as he can. This is what psychologists call moral complexity tolerance. The ability to sit with ambiguity, to recognize that most ethical situations don't have clean answers, and to make decisions anyway without being paralyzed by uncertainty. People who can't tolerate moral complexity tend to default to rigid rules or authority figures who tell them what's right. It's easier. It removes the burden of judgment, but it also leads to the kind of fanaticism the games criticize through groups like the Eternal Fire or the Witch Hunters. People so committed to moral simplicity that they'll burn innocence to preserve it. Geralt represents the harder path. He keeps his eyes open, he sees the complexity, he makes choices that haunt him, and he keeps going. The games externalize this internal process through the player. When you're agonizing over a dialogue choice, knowing that either option might lead to disaster, you're experiencing a fraction of what Geralt lives with constantly. The gameplay is moral stress simulation. And here's something the games do brilliantly: they delay consequences. You make a choice in Act 1 and don't see the fallout until Act 3. You can't save scum your way to a good outcome because you don't know what the outcomes are. This mimics real moral psychology. We make decisions with incomplete information and have to live with results we couldn't have predicted. By the end of Wild Hunt, Geralt isn't unburdened. He's not at peace with everything he's done, but he's developed a kind of psychological resilience that lets him keep functioning despite carrying significant moral weight. In therapeutic terms, he's developed distress tolerance, the capacity to experience painful emotions without being overwhelmed by them. This is ultimately what makes Geralt feel like a complete character. He's not a power fantasy of someone who always makes the right call. He's not a tragic figure crushed by his mistakes. He's someone who operates in impossible circumstances, does his best, fails sometimes, and keeps moving. That's a more honest representation of what it's like to be a thinking person in a complicated world than most games offer. So what do we actually learn from analyzing Geralt like this? I think we learned that good character writing mirrors good psychology. The things that make Geralt compelling, his contradictions, his defenses, his slow emotional evolution, are the same things that make real people complex. CD Projekt Red may not have set out to create a textbook study in attachment theory and moral psychology, but they understood human nature well enough to build a character that resonates on that level. Geralt's claimed emotionlessness teaches us about how people protect themselves from overwhelming pain. His identity struggles teach us about finding selfhood in a world that tries to define you. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments which aspect of Geralt's psychology you find most interesting and whether you think the game's earned his character arc. I'll see you in the next one.